Bagas was a cartographer, a man whose entire career was built on the certainty that what exists can be measured, named, and placed on a map. He was charting the Banda Sea when his instruments picked up something that had no right to be there. A full island with coastline and elevation, sitting in open water that every satellite image showed as empty ocean. He anchored and watched it for 3 hours before he believed it was real. The fisherman in the nearest village went silent when he described it. The elder, Pak Rohim, finally spoke. "Do not go there. Nothing you take from it stays clean." He told Bagas about those who had visited before. A man who returned unable to dream, a woman who could no longer recognize faces, a boy who spent his nights speaking a language no living person could identify. The island, Pak Rohim said, was not just land. It was everything the sea had swallowed and never released. Every loss, every unmourned death, every unfinished goodbye, rising to the surface when the monsoon ended, waiting for someone who finally knew how to listen. This is what happened when Bagas stopped trying to map the island, sat down inside its silence, and spoke to it instead. The instruments registered it at 6:14. Bagas had been at his station for 20 minutes, running the morning calibration sequence, a routine he performed the same way every day, in the same order, partly because the protocol required it, and partly because the structure of it helped him settle into the work. The Banda Sea in post-monsoon calm had a particular quality, flat and pale, and entirely still after weeks of weather, as if the water were catching its breath. The anomaly appeared on the depth sounder as a sudden rise in the seabed, and then on the radar as a surface feature. He checked the radar twice, adjusted the gain, checked again. The return was consistent, a landmass, small, low profile, approximately 2 nautical miles off the eastern edge of his survey corridor. He pulled up his chart overlay. The position showed open water. He pulled up the previous survey run from 8 weeks ago, before the monsoon closed down the fieldwork season. Open water. He pulled up the regional hydrographic chart from the National Institute, a document updated 18 months ago. Open water. He put on his jacket and went up to the survey vessel's deck and looked east. The mist was still clearing in the early morning light, burning off in the flat bands, the way it did when the weather had finally broken for good. And there, low and dark against the pale sky, unmistakable, was an island. He went to the village that afternoon. Tuul was the nearest settlement, a fishing community of perhaps 300 people on the larger island 2 kilometers west. Bagas had been working this area for 4 months. He knew the harbor, the market, the faces of the men who brought their boats in each morning. He had developed the kind of cordial professional relationship with the community that came from being present without being intrusive, exchanging greetings, buying fish, not asking too many questions. He asked questions now. The response was consistent and immediate. When he described what he had seen from the deck of his vessel, the island, eastern bearing 2 miles out, the men he spoke to either changed the subject or found somewhere else to be. Not rudely, the way people moved away from something they had an established policy about. He sat at the edge of the pier for a while, watching the boats come in, and eventually the old man came to him. Pak Rohim was in his 70s, a former fisherman who no longer went out but sat every afternoon at the pier end with a tin cup of coffee and the specific stillness of someone who had resolved his relationship with time. He sat down beside Bagas without being asked and looked out at the water. You saw it this morning, Pak Rohim said. Also, not a question. It's not on any chart, Bagas said, including mine. It wouldn't be. The old man drank his coffee. It comes when the rain stops. It goes when the rain returns. He was quiet for a moment. Every year the same. Bagas looked at him. How long has this been happening? How long has anyone been here? Pak Rohim set down his tin cup on the weathered wood between them. Longer than the oldest stories. Maybe longer than the stories remember. He did not look at Bagas when he said the next part. He looked at the water, at the eastern horizon where the island was still visible in the afternoon light. A low, dark shape that the sea was holding at its surface. Do not go there. Nothing you take from it stays clean. He said it the way people said things they had said before, that they expected to have to say again, and that they said anyway, because saying it was part of their responsibility. Even when it changed nothing. Bagas looked east at the island, 300 meters across, he estimated. Low, dark green vegetation against a gray-brown shoreline. No visible structures, no movement. He was a cartographer. There was a land mass on his survey that was not on his chart. He wrote down Pak Rohim's words in his field notebook and then sat with his pen above the page, not writing anything else, watching the island hold its position in the flat evening sea. The village had no written records. What it had was memory. Bagas had learned in 4 months of working this area that the communities of the Banda Sea kept their history the way people kept history before paper, in stories told with specific details, passed from person to person, maintained not by repetition alone, but by the weight of what they described. He had learned to listen for that weight. It was different from the weight of casual talk. It pressed down on the room differently. He spent the second morning at Pak Rohim's house with the notebook and the old man's permission, and he listened. There had been 3 cases in living or near living memory. Pak Rohim knew all 3, had heard 2 from his own father, had witnessed 1 himself. The first was a fisherman named Hendra, who had landed on the island in the post-monsoon calm of 1971. He had gone alone, curious, on a morning when the water was flat and the island was close. He came back to the village in the afternoon and said he had seen nothing unusual, just low trees and wet ground, and no animals, no birds, no sound. He ate dinner with his family. He went to sleep. In the morning, his wife noticed something wrong. She described it when she was old and Pak Rohim was young as follows. Hendra was the same person. He woke up, he worked, he spoke, he laughed in the same way. But he had stopped dreaming. Not that he forgot his dreams. He was certain, and remained certain until his death, that he simply did not dream anymore. He slept and he woke, and there was nothing between. He said it did not bother him. His wife said it bothered her deeply, because something about the way he moved through the days afterward was like watching a man walk through a house with all the furniture removed. The second was a woman named Sari, who landed on the island with a fishing party in 1984. An accident, their boat pushed by unexpected current, needing to wait out a short squall on the island's leeward side. She was 23. The party stayed 2 hours. Sari came back. The other fishermen came back. Only Sari changed. She forgot faces, not names. Names she kept. Not skills, not language, not the geography of the village or the habits of her daily life, but faces. The face of her mother, her husband, her children. Within a week of returning, she could not hold them in her mind. She knew who they were. She simply could not see them when they were absent, and when they were present, she looked at them with the careful attention of someone studying a thing they were trying to memorize. Her family found this difficult to bear in ways they could not fully articulate. Pak Rohim said she was not unkind. She was like someone looking at everything for the first time, every time. The third case, Pak Rohim had seen himself, a boy of 11 named Dani, who slipped away from the adults one post-monsoon afternoon and was found on the island's shore an hour later. He was brought back immediately, unharmed. That night, he spoke in his sleep. Not Bahasa, not the local dialect, something older, something that the oldest people in the village said sounded like nothing they had heard, and the younger people said sounded like nothing at all. Just a cadence, a rhythm, the shape of speech without the content. For 6 weeks, Dani spoke this language in his sleep and was silent during the day. Then both things stopped simultaneously, one night, and he was as he had been before. Pak Rohim folded his hands on the table. In every case, he said, the change did not begin on the island. It began the night after. As if whatever it was, it did not travel quickly. It walked behind them. It arrived while they slept. He looked at Bagas steadily. The island itself, they all said the same thing. No birds, no insects, no sound at all except their own feet on the ground. A pause. Not quiet, silent. There is a difference. Bagas looked at his notes. 3 cases, 3 different losses. A constant, the silence. He thought about Pak Rohim's phrase from the day before. Nothing you take from it stays clean. He was beginning to understand that this was not a warning about objects. The clouds began gathering in the afternoon, low and heavy on the western horizon. The advance of the weather that would end the clear window. By the time Bagas arrived at Pak Rohim's house, the light was already flat, and the air had the particular pressure of a sky about to close. The old man had prepared tea. He set it on the table without ceremony and sat down and looked at Bagas in the way he sometimes looked at him, as if completing an assessment that had been running since their first conversation. Tomorrow it rains, Pak Rohim said. The forecast says so. The forecast. He said the word without mockery, but with the mild tolerance of a man who had been reading the sky longer than any forecast system had existed in this part of the sea. Yes, tomorrow it rains, and the island will be gone the day after. He poured the tea. So, tonight, I will tell you what the old people knew. After tonight, it does not matter if you believe it. He did not begin with the island. He began with the monsoon. The monsoon months, he explained, were not simply weather. They were a season of accumulation. When the storms came in from the northwest and drove across the Banda Sea for 3 months, they moved through everything the water held. The wrecks of vessels that had gone down over centuries, the remains of people lost to storm and wave, and the ordinary violence of a sea this old and this wide. The storms disturbed what had settled. They drove things before them. They suspended in the churning water what had been lying still at the bottom for years or decades or longer. And at the end of every monsoon season, when the storms finally exhausted themselves and the sea went flat and the sky cleared, what the water had suspended needed somewhere to go. The island was where it went. It is not a place in the way your charts mean place, Pak Rohim said. He was looking at the table, not at Bagas, the way he looked when he was being precise about something. It does not have roots in the seabed the way a real island does. It rises because what it carries has enough weight and it dissolves back when the weight has dispersed. He looked up. It is more like a tide, something that forms and then returns. Bagas had his notebook open. He was writing, but slowly. He was listening more than he was writing. The people who went there, he said. Hendra, Sari, the boy. Pak Rohim nodded. They walked on the ground of the island. The ground is made of what the sea has accumulated, not only physical things, though there are physical things, but also the weight of the unresolved, the people who died far from home, who were not found, who were not mourned in the right way, who left things unfinished. He paused. When you walk on that ground, some of it attaches to you, not as a punishment, not deliberately. The way smoke attaches to your clothes when you stand near a fire. The island does not intend it. He was quiet for a moment. The island is trying to release what it holds. Every year it surfaces, and it waits, and nothing happens, and the rain returns, and it sinks again, still full. It has been doing this for a very long time. He looked at Bagas directly. It is not trying to harm anyone, he said. It is trying to be emptied. It does not know how. The room was quiet, except for the rain that had just begun. Earlier than predicted, a light preliminary rain tapping on the roof in the way of something testing the surface before it committed. Bagas sat with his notebook and looked at what he had written, and then looked at Pak Rohim. What would empty it? He asked. The old man looked out the window at the darkening water. Someone who came to give something instead of take something, he said. Someone who understood what it held and spoke to it accordingly. He picked up his tea. In all the years I have known this island, no one has done that. He did not say, you could. He did not need to. He left the vessel at first light with the small rowboat and no equipment he intended to bring back. Not no equipment. He carried water, a knife from habit, his notebook. But the notebook he had decided on the way down the ladder he would leave in the boat. He thought about this for a moment, standing in the boat with the oars in his hands, and confirmed it. What he was going to do on the island was not something he needed a record of. It was not that kind of work. The water was absolutely flat. Post-monsoon calm in the Banda Sea had a quality unlike any other stillness he had worked in. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, as if the sea were holding everything in place very deliberately while it caught its breath. The rowboat moved through it with a precision that felt excessive, each stroke carrying him further than it should have. The island grew ahead of him without drama. He reached the shore in 20 minutes. He pulled the boat up on a low shelf of brown rock and stood at the island's edge. Pak Rohim had been right about the silence. He had worked in remote places, ocean survey stations, uninhabited atolls, stretches of open sea with nothing living in earshot. He knew the different registers of quiet. This was not a register he had encountered before. There were no birds. There were no insects, despite the vegetation. Gray-green scrub that looked like it should sustain them, that had the density and humidity insects required. There was no wind. There was no sound, except the soft pressure of his boots on wet earth as he moved inland, and even that felt muffled, as if the ground were absorbing it. The island was small enough that the center was not far. He moved through the scrub slowly, not pushing branches aside so much as parting them and letting them return. And after perhaps 5 minutes of walking, he came to the depression. It was shallower than he had imagined. A bowl in the ground, maybe 3 meters across, and less than a meter deep at its lowest point. But it was full, not overflowing, not compacted, just densely, carefully full. The way a drawer became full over years of adding small things and never removing them. He crouched at the edge and looked at what it held. Fragments of wood, some painted, some plain. A length of corroded chain, green-black with age. Cloth in various states of dissolution. Thread still holding some pieces together. Others reduced to fibers pressed into the earth. Ceramic shards, the kind that could have come from a ship's galley or a household vessel. A corroded metal fitting whose original purpose he could not identify. Something that might have been a sandal once. Something that might have been a child's toy. He sat down at the depression's edge and crossed his legs and looked at it for a while. He was a cartographer. He worked with coastlines, seabeds, the measurable physical world. He was not a person who spoke aloud to empty places. He was aware of this about himself as he'd sat there. And he was also aware that he had rowed here specifically to do this, and that the reasons were sufficient, even if he could not have written them into a methodology. He started with what he knew. He talked about the sea, about what it took. Storms that came without enough warning. Vessels that went down faster than the records suggested. The gap between a person being present and being gone. He talked about what it meant to map a place and how the maps were always incomplete, and how the incompleteness was not a failure, but an acknowledgement that the sea held more than could be charted. He talked about loss in the plain language of someone who had experienced it and had not spoken about it for a long time. He said it carefully and without performance, into the silence, which received it without comment. He did not take anything from the depression. He did not add anything to it. When he stopped talking, the silence had changed. He could not have described it precisely. It was not louder. It was not different in any measurable way. But it was no longer the held silence of something that had been waiting for a very long time. It had become the ordinary silence of a place between one thing and another. He sat with it for a few minutes. Then he stood and walked back to the boat. He was back at the vessel by 8. The clouds were already moving in from the northwest. Not the sharp front edge of a storm, but the long, slow advance of a weather system settling in for days. The light had changed. Where the post-monsoon morning had been flat and pale and precise, the sky was now a uniform grey that softened every edge and made the water look heavier than it was. Bagas tied up the rowboat and went below and made coffee and sat at his chart table. He was checking himself in the way he had learned to check himself after situations that he could not fully account for, methodically, without either dramatizing or dismissing. He ran through the list. He remembered every face on the island, every object in the depression, every word he had said, and in what order he had dreamed the night before. He was certain of this because he had a habit of brief waking in the early morning, and he had woken with the specific residue of a dream still present, ordinary and unremarkable. He could see the faces of his family when he closed his eyes. He had language. He was the same. Something had shifted, but it was not the shift the villagers described. Nothing had been subtracted. It was more like the difference in a room after you have opened a window that had been shut for too long. The room was the same room. It was just easier to breathe in. He opened his report template and began to write. The survey report was standard in almost every respect. He completed the sections on methodology, equipment, environmental conditions, data quality assessments. He logged the days of post-monsoon survey work, the depths sounded, the coastline features verified or corrected. It was the kind of document the Hydrographic Institute received from field teams every season, thorough and technical and unremarkable. Then he came to the anomalous feature entry. He sat with the cursor in the description field for a moment. A cartographer's job was precision. To describe what was there, in language that would allow another person to find and verify it. He had coordinates. He had the radar return dimensions. He had his own visual observation and the depth sounder record. He typed the coordinates. He typed the approximate dimensions. He typed the dates of appearance, the morning after the monsoon broke, and noted the expected departure when the rain returned. Then he typed the notation, seasonal appearance, believed by local communities to be a site of accumulated maritime loss. Recommend no extraction, no settlement, no further survey. Acknowledge and leave. He read it back. He knew it would generate a query from the Institute, at minimum, a request for clarification. Possibly a requirement to justify the recommendation with more conventional language. He was prepared for that. He would explain what he had observed, what he had been told, and what he had concluded. He did not think the conclusion would be accepted in its current form. He thought it was the correct conclusion regardless. He saved the report and closed the laptop. He went to Pak Rohim's house in the early afternoon, before the rain came in fully. The old man was on his porch, watching the weather come. He looked at Bagas when he climbed the steps, and he looked at him in the careful way, the assessment that had been running since the first conversation, and appeared to complete it. "You went," he said. "This morning." Pak Rohim nodded slowly. He looked at Bagas for another moment, then out at the water. "You came back the same," he said. It was an observation, not a question. "I think so. You spoke to it instead of taking from it." He said this matter-of-factly. The way he said things he had worked out already. That is why. They sat for a while without speaking. The rain began. A steady, serious rain, the kind that meant several days. Out east, where the island had been visible for a week, there was only grey water and grey sky, and the Banda Sea doing what it had always done, which was to hold everything it was given and wait for someone to understand what it needed. Bagas stood to leave. Pak Rohim did not stand, but he lifted a hand in farewell. A small gesture, deliberate. "Come back next year," he said, "after the monsoon." Bagas looked at him. "To check the chart?" he asked. Pak Rohim looked at the rain. "To speak to it again," he said, "in case it needs it." If this story stayed with you, I think it was meant to. New stories from across Asia, every week, right here. I'm Haunted East. Subscribe if you want to keep listening.